Okay, Rabbi, we're on DAF Yud Gimel Amid Aleph, and we have this machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir as far as what the timetable is on Erev Pesach. Rabbi Yehuda is more machmir, and he says that you can only eat chametz during the 4th hour, but by the 5th hour of the day, which is like between 10 and 11 in the morning, and using our clocks, you can't eat chametz anymore, but you're not yet obligated to completely eliminate the chametz until the beginning of the 6th hour, which is like from 11 o'clock. Okay? So that's Rabbi Yehuda's position. So therefore, chametz is still mutter b'hana'ah during the 5th hour. According to Rabbi Meir, you're allowed to eat chametz during the entire 5th hour, and you burn it at the beginning of the 6th. Everyone agrees that you burn it at the beginning of the 6th. The machlokus is regarding the 5th hour. During the 5th hour, according to Rabbi Yehuda, no longer can you eat it, only hana'ah is permitted. And according to Rabbi Meir, you're even allowed to eat. Okay, so as long as we have that clear, that's going to be the springboard for our discussions today.
And what's the primordial benefit of hana'ah? Like, in other words, to be able to sell the chametz?
You can sell it to a non-Jew. You can feed it to your animals.
Okay, right. Okay, sure.
Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rav, halacha ka Rabbi Yehuda. So Rav Nachman says in the name of Rav that we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda to be machmir during the 5th hour. Amar le Rav le Rav Nachman b'nei Amar halacha ka Rabbi Meir desasan lantana kavase. So Rava says to Rav Nachman, you should have said better that the halacha is like Rav Meir, because after all, there is a stam mishnah, there's an anonymous mishnah that goes according to Rabbi Meir, as we're going to see later on, ditnan kol sha'a shemuter le'achol ma'achil, that it says any time that it is permitted to eat, it is permitted to feed to your animals, which implies by inference that any time that you're not allowed to eat, you're not allowed to feed to your animals. So that would imply like Rabbi Meir, who says that you can eat up until the time when you're no longer allowed to derive benefit, so you can eat for the entire 5th hour. So the Gemara says no. Hahi lav stamahu, so mishum dekasha mutter. So we're going to see when we learn Perek Kol Sha'a, when we learn this Mishnah actually inside, the Gemara is going to make an inference from the language. It says Kol Sha'a shemutter le'achol ma'achil, which is a very strange language. It should have said Kol Sha'a she'ochlin ma'achil, or Kol Sha'a she'ochel ma'achil. As long as you can eat, you can feed. But instead of saying, being reductionist in its language, it's actually adding the word mutter. Why does it have to say the word mutter? As long as it is permitted to eat, you can feed. The word mutter is extraneous. So the Gemara makes a diuk that Mishnah does not go according to Rabbi Meir, but rather goes according to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, of our Mishnah. If you go back to our Mishnah, what did Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, Rabbi Gamliel, what did Rabbi Gamliel say? Rabbi Gamliel had said that there is a 5th hour compromise position. And that compromise position is that you're not allowed to eat chulin, but you're allowed to eat truma if you're a kohen. Remember that? That was the discussion in the Mishnah. So Rabbi Gamliel is the compromise position, and the Gemara says that extra word mutter implies that it really means as long as it's permitted for a kohen to eat truma, you're allowed to feed to your animals. But not as long as it's permitted to eat chulin. That's what the extra word mutter is coming to teach in that Mishnah. So what you clearly see is that Mishnah does not go according to Reb Meir, but rather goes according to Rabbi Gamliel. So Tosfos then asks the simple question, well then why don't you say that we should paskin like Rabbi Gamliel then? That's not what we're going to see. The Gemara is not advocating that at this point, based on the fact that you have a Stam Mishnah, let's go like Rabbi Gamliel. Because Tosfos says the Gemara is going to take the discussion in another direction. Really, the Gemara could have asked that question, but it's going to ask a different question now. So the Gemara says, "V'neimer mar halacha k'Rabbi Gamliel dahavle machriya." Why then don't you say that the halacha is like Rabbi Gamliel, not based on the fact that it's a Stam Mishnah, but based on the fact that he's the machriya, he's the compromise position. In other words, you have Rabbi Yehuda who says you can't eat anything during the 5th hour. Rabbi Meir says you can eat everything during the 5th hour. And Rabbi Gamliel says, no, you can eat truma, you just can't eat chulin. And normally, we try to find that middle ground, right? You try to find the compromise. If only politicians in Israel would know that, right? You try to find the middle ground, right? And so we should paskin like Rabbi Gamliel. So the Gemara now says, Amar le Rabbi Gamliel lav machriyahu tam denafshe ka'amar. And Rashi explains what this means. The Gemara basically says Rabbi Gamliel is not a compromised position. He's offering a third his own position. And what that means is that the only time you say that someone is a compromised position is if he's articulating a compromise where the two other sides had said the 2 points of extreme, and he says, I'll take one from this column and one from that column. So let me give you an example. If Rabbi Yehuda would have said, you can neither eat chulin nor truma during the 5th hour, and Rabbi Meir says you can eat both chulin and the truma during the 5th hour, if they had stated those terms explicitly, and then Rabbi Gamliel would have come along and said you can eat only truma but not chulin, so then Rabbi Gamliel would represent a compromised position. But when you look at the terminology that's used in the Mishnah, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda never made any distinction between chulin and truma. They never addressed chulin or truma. So you see that for them, this was not an issue of making that distinction at all. They never made that distinction. So the Rabbi Gamliel is the only one who creates such a distinction. That's not called a compromise. That's called a third opinion. Yeah, am I making myself? I hope I'm making myself clear.
But Rabbi Gamliel's position only benefits the Kohanim, though.
Correct.
Correct. Right.
Well, Kohanim are no one to sneeze at. You know, they're not such bad people. Anyway, so the Gemara now says. So the Gemara says now like this: V'bois ema. I'll give you another answer. I'll give you another explanation as to why we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. In other words, even if you'll argue that you have a Stam Mishnah that does not go like Rabbi Yehuda, either like Rabbi Meir or Rabbi Gamliel, but let me give you another answer as to why we should paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. Because Rav da Amar ki haytana, because Rav actually sees another Tana who paskins like Rabbi Yehuda. The Tanya arbas or shechalios b'Shabbos mevaranis akol milifnei haShabbos. That the Brisa says that when the 14th of Nisan falls out on Shabbos, and therefore you can't do biur, you can't actually burn the chametz on Erev Pesach, you should burn everything on the 13th before Shabbos. V'sarfin trumos tumeos tuluyos utahoros, and you burn all truma, regardless of whether it's completely tameh or if it's taloy, which means that you have a suffix whether it's tameh or tohor, and therefore you have to. The halacha is you can't burn truma that you're not sure is tameh. You have to let it rot and decompose until it's no longer edible, and then you can dispose of it. And even tohar truma, so all three of those things you burn. You actively burn them, even though normally you're not allowed to burn truma that's tohar. Here you do burn it because you have no other option. You got to get rid of it. So u'mishayrin min ha'tohoros mazon shtei sudos k'dei lechol adalat shaos divrei Rebbe Elazar ben Yehuda. And the only thing that you leave over of your truma if you're a kohen is you leave over enough for 2 meals for Shabbos. That's all you leave over, and the rest you have to dispose of before, because you have to burn everything. Now this is according to Rebbe Elazar ben Yehuda, and if you notice, he says that you can only eat it up until the 4th hour. So you see that Rebbe Elazar ben Yehuda holds like Rebbe Yehuda that you can only eat during the 4th hour, but you cannot eat during the 5th hour. And he is Ish Bartusa. He's a man from Bartusa, Sha'amar Mishum Rebbe Yehoshua, who's quoting Rebbe Yehoshua, the earlier Tana. So Amrulo, so the rabbis responded to his claim, and they said, Tahoros lo yisarfu shemeyimtsu lohen ochlin. He says it's not right to incinerate truma that's still tohor, because who knows? Maybe on Shabbos someone will come in and visit you, and you'll be able to feed it to them. So by what right do you have to dispose of it in this way? Could someone please open up Benny's Gemara? So Amr Lahen Kvar Bikshu V'lo Matzu. So the response was, I'm sorry, we have to presume that someone knows who their neighbors are and someone knows who's in their town. And we have to assume that the person went out and tried to seek out people who could help him eat this truma, and he wasn't able to find anyone. And if he wasn't able to find anyone, so why should you have to be choshesh that maybe someone's going to show up unexpected? So Amrulo Shemachutz Lachom Alanu. So the Chachamim said, well, you don't know necessarily someone may come from out of town. Someone may have lodged right outside the city walls before Shabbos, and they'll surprise you. So you don't know. So Amar Lahem, so Rebbe Elazar ben Yehuda responds to them, and he says, L'divreichem af teluyos lo yisarfu, shema yavo Eliyahu v'yatahare. He says, well, by that argument, even Safek truma that's suffik, whether it's tamei or tahor, you shouldn't be allowed to burn, because maybe Eliyahu Hanavi will come Erev Pesach and tell you that it's really tahor, and you can eat it. I mean, if you're going to worry about all possible contingencies, worry about that as well. So Amr Lo Kvar Muftach Lahen Li Yisrael Shein Eliyahu Ba Lo Ba'arvei Shabbosos V'Lo Ba'arvei Yomim Tovim Mipnei HaTorach. The Chachamim said we're not worried about that because we already have a guarantee that Eliyahu Hanavi is not going to come on Erev Shabbos and Erev Yontif when all the balabustas are preparing for Yontif and Shabbos. That would create a tremendous inconvenience for our families, and therefore we have a promise that Eliyahu Hanavi is not going to come on Erev Shabbos and Erev Yontif. He's very considerate, Eliyahu, even when it's time for the Geula. But if he's going to disrupt making Shabbos and making Yontif, he'll delay the Geula. It's a tremendous concept when you think about it. He doesn't want to. He doesn't want to inconvenience us. So anyway, Amru lo zazu misham ad shekavu halacha Rabbi Elazar ben Yehuda ish bartusa shama misham Rabbi Yehoshua. So even though the rabbis had a response to everything that Rabbi Elazar ben Yehuda was saying, nevertheless, they did not move from there until they established the halacha like him, that any truma that is in your possession on the 13th, when the 14th coincides with with Shabbos, you have to incinerate on the 13th, except for the amount that you need for 2 meals on Shabbos. So my lava filulech. Also, isn't that to imply that we paskin like Rabbi Elazar ben Yehuda, even as far as the ability to eat it only until the 4th hour, and you see therefore that he goes like Rabbi Yehuda. So it's on that basis that Rav paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. So Amar Rav Papa mishmei derav lo liva er. So Rav Papa says it's not necessarily proof from here, because maybe when it says that the rabbis paskin like Rabbi Elazar ben Yehuda, it was only vis-a-vis his declaration that you have to burn everything on the 13th. But as far as until what time do you have to eat chametz on the 14th, maybe that's not what they were paskening like when we said they pasken like Rabbi Elazar ben Yehuda. But in any event, va'af Rebbe savar lahadar Rav Nachman. Even though we have no confirmation as to why Rav Nachman in the name of Rav paskens like Rebbe Yehuda, we nevertheless can support that fact by looking at what Rebbe had done, because Rebbe also paskens like Rebbe Yehuda. The Amar Rabin bar Rav Ada Maaseh ba'adam echad shehifkid diskaya malaya chametz eitzel Yochanan chakuka'a. That there was once a story where a man had a bag full of food that was chametz, and he left it for safekeeping with a gentleman named Yochanan chakuka'a. V'nakvua achborim, and the rats ate into the bag. V'haya chametz mevatzveitz v'yotze, and the chametz was spilling all over the place. And this was creating an unwieldy situation for the person who was watching over it. It was becoming Erev Pesach. The fellow did not know, the fellow did not want to cause the person who had left the chametz with him a financial loss, and he didn't know how to deal with the situation. Uva lifnei Rebbe, so the fellow comes before Rebbe to ask a shaila, what should I do with this bag of chametz? I can't just completely put it somewhere where no one will find it. I guess because it's spilling out, it's not containable anymore, and so therefore he couldn't seal it off completely. Perhaps maybe that would have been permitted since it was not in the person's purview, and he would have maybe put it under lock and key, and the guy could have been mevatel it. But no, it's not practical because the bag is now burst. So I'm going to have to get rid of it. What should I do to save the owner from financial ruin? So Shah Rishona Amar Lo Hamtein. So the first hour of Erev Pesach, Rebbe said, hold on. Shniya Amar Lo Hamtein, same the second hour. Shlishis Amar Lo Hamtein, Revias Amar Lo Hamtein. He did the same thing for the third hour and the fourth hour. Chamishis Amar Leitzeu Mochur B'Shug. So during the fifth hour, he told him, go out now and sell it in the marketplace. So my lav l'nochrim ka Rebbe Yehuda, which implies that he was only telling him to sell it to Gentiles, like Rebbe Yehuda says that during the fifth hour you cannot eat it anymore, but you can get benefit from it. So now the reason why the Gemara makes this assumption is because if it was permitted for Jews to eat, then why would it be necessary to go out and sell it in the marketplace? Let the person who's watching over it eat it himself or buy it himself. So Amar Rav Yosef lo li Yisrael ka Rebbe Meir. So Rav Yosef says no, it really could be that Rebbe was instructing him to sell it to a Jew, because maybe Rebbe holds like Rebbe Meir, who says that even during the fifth hour you're allowed to eat it. So Amar le Abaya iluy Yisrael nishkale lenafshe. So Abaya asked the obvious question, well then why did Rebbe tell him to sell it in the shuk? Why couldn't the guy purchase it himself and set aside money for the person who had deposited these goods with him, and he would have given them the money himself. So mishum cheshada. The answer is no, says Rav Yosef. The answer is because that's not proper to do, not because of chametz issues, but because of suspicion issues. Now, what do we mean by suspicion? Detanya gabayt staka shein lahem aniyim lechalek porten la'acher vein porten la'atzman. That if you're a person who collects money for tzedakah, you go around passing around the pushka during davening, and you're in charge of allotting the tzedakah to the poor. So you have a whole bunch of, let's say, leftover tzedakah because you already made your distributions to all the poor that came to the door, and now you want to be able to take all the change and change it into larger coinage, which is the appropriate thing to do, so that because with larger coins you'll have less deterioration of the coinage, less loss. So the only halacha is that you can't make the change yourself. You can't take your own silver coins and exchange them for the copper coins that people gave you. Why? Because of cheshad, because no one should suspect, hey, you're capitalizing, you're enterprising off of money of the tzedakah. People will accuse you of maybe being on the take and skimming off the top. So gabay tamchoy she'en lahem aniyim lechalek mochen lachem ve'en mochen la'atzmim mishum shenamar these in the kiyum Hashem in Israel. And similarly, if you're in charge of the food kitchen for the poor and you've already distributed all the food and you've got leftovers, you can sell that food to other people, but you can't purchase it yourself. Again, because people will accuse you of buying it at a discount, and you're actually capitalizing off of tzedakah contributions. As the Torah says, you must be clean not only from God but from Israel as well. This is from this week's parsha, from Parshas Matos, that Moshe Rabbeinu instructs Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain that you got to be clean, and not only in God's eyes, but you got to be clean in Hashem, in Israel's eyes as well. They can't accuse you of trying to get off easy by not going to war. So in any event, you see from here that the reason why Rebbe instructed the fellow to sell the chametz on Erev Pesach was not because it was forbidden for him to eat, but rather because of cheshad, that no one should suspect him for being on the take and skimming off the top. Armalei Ravada Bar Masna Rav Yosef beferish Amrat Lan Seu Mochen Lenachim Kerebi Yehuda. So Ravada Bar Masna was one of Rav Yosef's students who reminded him that he had amnesia. And he said, Rebbe, you had previously instructed us, despite your argumentation to the contrary, you had previously told us that Rebbe had paskin like Rebbe Yehuda, and that's why he told the guy to sell it in the market, because he was telling him to sell it only to Gentiles, because during the 5th hour it's usher for Jews. Amar Rav Yosef, Kaman Azla Hashmai to the Rebbe, Kershim and Gamliel. Now, an independent statement of Rav Yosef is that the very fact that Rebbe said that it's okay to go ahead and sell the chametz means that he must paskin like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. What is this statement? There's a Mishnah that says that if a person is in charge of produce that was left for him for safekeeping, even if he detects that the produce is beginning to rot, he's not allowed to sell it. He can't touch it, he can't do anything with it. He's got to wait for the mafkid, for the owner to come back and reclaim it, even if by the time he reclaims it, it'll be partially or totally rotted. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer Mochen Bebesim Ibnei Hashavas Aveda. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel disagrees, and he says no. If you notice that the produce is going to depreciate in value, then there's a mitzvah for you to save the fellow's assets, and therefore you should go ahead and sell it, even though he hasn't instructed you as such. And you'll be able to get a good price for it, and you'll give him the cash. Now, Amr, so you see, the very fact that Rebbe had instructed this fellow to sell the chametz means that he must paskin like Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, that you should watch out for the person's assets.
You should have done it many hours earlier. He was selling by the 5th hour.
Oh, so the question is, well, why didn't he do it earlier in the day? Presumably, it's because he was hoping that maybe the guy would come back. In other words, I can't tell you to sell it prematurely. Maybe he's going to come back and he's going to want it himself. So wait until the last minute where you know he's not going to come, and that's why you should sell it. So Amar le'Abaye v'lavit marla Amar Rabba bar Barchana Amar Rabbi Yechanan lo shanu ella b'chdei chesronan abel yoser michdei chesronan mochrim beveisin v'chol shkein hacha dehapsidi legamre. So Abaye says no. You could say that Rebbe paskins even like the Tanakama of that Mishnah over there in Hamafkid. Because in the case of the mafkid over there was a natural deterioration of the produce in a very gradual way. And that's where the Tanakama says you have no right to touch it, because you have to wait for that guy to come back, because it's very slowly depreciating in value. And perhaps the guy should know that, and so he'll come back when he's good and ready to come back. But in a case where there's a rapid depreciation of value, or a complete depreciation of value, which is the case over here, where the chametz is going to become totally valueless if I let it wait until beyond the 5th hour, even the Tanakama would agree that the nifgad, the shomer, the guy who's watching over it, is allowed to sell it in order to be able to save a complete financial loss from the owner. Okay, so therefore it could be even according to the Tanakam. Next, Va'od Amar Rabbi Yehuda shtei chalos v'chulei. Rabbi Yehuda is quoted in our Mishnah as supporting his position that during the 5th hour it's asur ba'achila but mutter ba'hana, and he proves it by saying that during the times of the temple there were two loaves of bread that were from a korban toda, and they were chametz, because the 10 out of the 30 loaves of the korban toda were made from chametz. They would take two of those loaves, and they would place them in a very prominent place on the Temple Mount where the entire public could see it. During the 4th hour, they would leave both loaves there. That would instruct people that it was still permitted to eat and benefit from chametz. During the 5th hour, they would only have one challah. They would take away one challah, and that would instruct people that they can benefit still from chametz, but they can't eat it. And at the beginning of the 6th hour, they would take away the remaining challah, and when they would see that there was no challah there, they would know that it was time to burn it. So the Gemara just says, and where did they place this? They placed it on something called an itztaba. An itztaba is a type of bench that was prominently somewhere out, I guess, by the entrance of the Temple Mount. Tani Tana Kameder Rav Yehuda al Gav ha'Itztaba. So the brisa, that the way that the Mishnah was taught to Rav Yehuda was the word Gav is Gimel Beis, on top of the bench. So Amalei v'chilatz nian hutzarich tani al Gag ha'Itztaba. So Rav Yehuda says that's the wrong term. He says because by just putting it on top of a bench, it may remain hidden from people. People won't see it because it's not displayed conspicuously. But rather you have to read it al Gag ha'Itztaba, that it was on the rooftop of the Itztaba. Apparently this bench had a structure above it, I guess maybe to protect people from the elements. It sounds to me almost like it was like a bus stop kind of bench. I don't know if I'm envisioning it correctly or not, but perhaps it was like it had like this frame over it to protect people if they wanted to sit there. And so by putting it on the bench, it wouldn't be as conspicuous, but rather they put it on the rooftop of the Itztaba, and that way people would be able to see it from far away. What? No, not on the CN Tower, sorry.
CN Tower.
Okay. Amar Rachba, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Har Habaya Stav Kaful Haya. Now, I don't think that this advances our discussion of the two loaves of bread. I just think that Rachba is explaining the way that it was configured, the benches were configured on the Har Habayis. He just says Stav Kaful. I told you to talk about a stav today. Stav Kaful Haya, that it was a double bench kind of seating arrangement. That it was, I guess, multiple benches in several different rows, and Rashi explains that there were benches that went all the way around the Temple Mount, and then there was concentric circles of benches. It seems the way Rashi is describing it. I don't really know how else to describe it. That seems to me what it was like. It was like park benches that went all around the Temple Mount in two circles. Tanya Nomi Hachi, Harabai Stav Kaful Haya, the Brisa says the same thing. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Istavanis Haisa Nikres, Stav Lifnim Mistav. And that's the reason why it was called the Istavanis. Istavanis almost sounds like it's a Greek word, but what the Gemara is telling you is it's not.
For certain area.
What?
That for there's rain in Kere for this time.
It was for rain?
For rain. It was come raining, water come down. Drain. Like drain.
Oh, that it was for draining purposes?
Yeah. That's in Izrat Nashim. In Izrat Nashim.
Uh-huh. It was in the Ezras Nashim?
Izrat Nashim.
No.
It was column.
Kumar Ezrat Nashim.
No. In Izrat Nashim, there's a...
no, in the Ezras Nashim,
in
the Ezras Nashim, you can't sit. I don't believe that's... We're talking about the Temple Mount. They're not talking about the structure of the temple itself. So it sounds to me like it's around the periphery of the Temple Mount. I don't know that there's... Anyway.
No, inside of Izrat Nashim was column. There's a lot of column and steps.
Yeah, I don't think that's what we're talking about over here. I don't think so. I could be wrong, but I think we're talking about on the periphery of the Temple Mount. And I don't know, where is this issue of drainage? Who was saying something about drainage?
No, the benches have roofs on them to prevent it from the rain coming down.
Oh, yeah, like I was saying, like a bus stop.
Right.
Yeah.
The rain.
Yeah.
I bring you video.
Like a portico.
Okay, all right. Okay, psulos v'chulei. So the Mishnah says that these two loaves were puzzle, which means they were from, it seems like the carbon itself had become puzzle. So amai psulos. Why or how did these breads become puzzle? So Amar Rabbi Chanina mitoch shahayu merubos nifsalos belina. Rabbi Chanina explains that what they would do is that people would typically bring their carbon todas when they would make a pilgrimage to Yerushalayim. So there were tons of, you bring a carbon toda when you want to express gratitude to Hashem, but you didn't make a special trip to Yerushalayim to do it. So you would wait until you'd make a pilgrimage, which would be either, Pesach, Shavuos, or Sukkot. And so when you came up to Yerushalayim for Pesach, you not only came to bring a carbon Pesach, but a lot of people came to bring a carbon toda. Since there were so many loaves of bread, you had 40 loaves per carbon, there was a lot of abundance, a lot of leftover bread. It's almost like, people say, why are you giving Shalach Manas on Purim? You get all this leftover chametz. So imagine if you came to bring a carbon toda right before Pesach, all this leftover chametz, right, that was in Yerushalayim. So they would take two of those loaves that had already passed the expiration time, because a carbon toda can only be eaten the day that it's brought and the following evening. But by the morning of the 14th, this bread was already puzzle belina.
There's 40 loaves each one, right?
That's right, 40 loaves. Tanya, ein mevi'in toda b'chag hamatzos mipnei chametz Shabbat. And as the Brisa says, you're not allowed to bring a carbon toda on Pesach. You got to get rid of it before Pesach because of the chametz that's in it. So the Gemara says pshita. Why does the Brisa need to tell me that? That seems to be fairly obvious. Amar Rav Ada bar Ahava hacha b'yodalet askinan u'kesaver ein mevi'in kachin lebeis hapesul. The point of the Brisa is to tell me that not only can you not bring a carbon toda on Pesach itself, but even Erev Pesach, you're not allowed to bring a carbon toda. Even on the morning of the 14th, when chametz is still permitted. Why is that? Because the halacha is, according to this Manda Amar, that I'm not allowed to bring a carbon with the foreknowledge that I'm going to be limiting the time in which I can eat it. Meaning, if the Torah normally tells me that I have 24 hours to eat this carbon, but I bring it at a time where I'm going to be limited from some other external factor from eating it for those 24 hours, I'm not allowed to even bring the carbon at that time. On Erev Pesach, if I bring the carbon toda, the most that I'll have to eat the bread is 6 hours. So therefore, the Torah does not allow me to bring a carbon in that time, because I'm prematurely causing the sacrificial food to become inedible. So that's the point. You can't bring a carbon toda on Erev Pesach, which is why those of you who are astute on Erev Pesach during davening, we don't say Mizmor L'Soda on Erev Pesach, because Mizmor L'Soda corresponds to the carbon toda, and any day that you can't bring the carbon toda, you don't say Mizmor L'Soda. So Mr. Sheila is on the ball. The Kulei Alma, Bishlosha Sar Maisi Lahu, so Umitoch Shein Merubos Nipsalos Belina. And therefore the point that we're trying to convey here is that everyone holds that you'd have to bring your carbon toda on the 13th, not on the 14th, but because there's so much abundance of bread, and you don't have, and there's not enough people to eat all of this chametz bread, it becomes pasul belina, it's left over till the morning of the 14th, and there's no one that could eat it. So they would take two of those loaves and I guess display them. So Mishum Rabbi Yanai Amru Kesheros Hayu. Rabbi Yanai disagrees, and he says no. It seems like, and I could be mistaken, but it seems like Rabbi Yanai says that you could even theoretically bring a carbon toda even on Erev Pesach, because maybe he holds that you are allowed to bring a carbon even though it's going to be prematurely cut short. He says and these loaves of bread were perfectly kosher. So the Ela Mai Kari Lehu Psulo. So then why were they called pasul? Why are they called pasul loaves in the Mishnah? Shelo Nishchat Alein Hazevach. The answer is because that what they would typically do is they would find two loaves of bread where the animal had not yet been slaughtered. So the nishchot. So then why waste the bread? Just shech the animal and bring the carbon toda. Answers the Gemara Sha'avad Hazavach, because the animal got lost. And since the animal got lost, the bread can no longer be brought. The Gemara Well, why not? Granted, the bread is sacrificial bread because it's been designated for a korban toda, but just replace the animal and bring it with a different animal. The Amar Toda Zu, the Amar Zu Toda V'Zu Lachma, Uchida Rabba. The answer is we're talking about a case where the person, when he designated his bread, he said, this is going to be the bread and this is going to be the animal. And since he said it in that type of specific way, he made an inexorable connection between this bread and this animal, such that if this animal gets lost, then I can no longer use this bread with any other korban. Because Rabba had said, the Omar Rabba, Avad halechem mevi lechem acher. Of the Toda, ein mevi Toda acheres. That he said that if the bread gets lost from a designated korban Toda, then you could always bring new loaves of bread. But if the animal gets lost, you can't replace it with another animal to accompany this bread, because my time alechem glal Toda ve'ein Toda glal lechem. The answer is because the bread is ancillary to the animal. The animal is not ancillary to the bread. So therefore, it is acceptable that if you lose the bread, since you have the mainstay of the korban still here, just replace sort of like the ancillary item. But if you lose the main item, which is the animal itself, then the bread which was designated as ancillary to that animal can no longer be used with any other korban. So frek the Gemara v'nifra kinu v'nafkinu l'chulin. The Gemara says, but still wait a minute. As long as the animal has not been slaughtered, this bread is redeemable. Now, remember, I just want to remind you, in Kodshim we talk about two types of Kedusha that is attached to sacrificial items. One is Kedushas Damim and the other one is Kedushas Aguf. When you have a financial attachment of Kedusha to something, then it is redeemable. When you have an intrinsic, what's called Kedushas Aguf, an intrinsic Kedusha that is attached to an item, then it can no longer be redeemed and have its Kedusha removed. So long as the animal of the korban toda was not slaughtered, the bread only has Kedushas Damim. It only has financial Kedusha, but it doesn't have Kedushas Aguf, doesn't have intrinsic Kedusha. And therefore, you could still redeem this bread onto coinage and purchase a whole new geschäft, purchase a whole new animal, a whole new korban, and start all over again. So if you've got these loaves of bread that cannot be brought with another korban toda, so then merely redeem the bread onto coinage and start all over again. So the Gemara says, you're right. We can't be talking about that. If we're talking about bread which is still kosher but is considered to be no longer usable, it's as follows. But rather we're talking about where the animal was slaughtered for the korban toda, v'nishbach hadam, and then the blood, before I had a chance to sprinkle the blood to affect the objective of the korban, the blood got spilled on the ground and I could no longer do zrika. Ucheman kerebi, and this would seem therefore to go like Rabbi. The Amar Rabbi, shnei dvarm hamatirim ma'alin zeh below zeh. Now Rabbi, it's a strange language, but let me just explain what Rabbi means. That if there are two steps in which you affect the sort of the accomplishment of the korban, then even if you do one step and without the second step, the first step elevates all of the sacrificial items, even without the second step. Now what this means is we've got two steps in the offering of this korban to completely accomplish the desired effect of the korban. The first step is the shechita, and the second step is the zrika, is the sprinkling of the blood. According to Rebbe, if you shech the animal, at that moment when you've shechted it, you've already created kedushas haguf on all of the ancillary items of that korban, including the bread, even before you've done the zrika. So therefore, in theory, what we're talking about is bread where the animal was shechted, but you didn't accomplish the desired effect of the korban because you never did the zrika, and so the bread is nishtahin nishtaher. It has kedusha saguf, but you can't eat it because the korban was never accomplished. The desired effect of the korban was never accomplished. You can only eat the bread once you do the zrika. So the bread got elevated through the shechita, but it didn't become mutter ba'achila, it didn't become permissible because you never did a zrika. At the Tanya, as the Brisa says, Kibsei atzeres ein mekachenes alechem ela b'shchita. As the Brisa says, that on Shavuos you have to bring 2 sheep together with 2 loaves of bread. So at what time do the loaves of bread acquire their kedusha saguf, their intrinsic kedusha? At the time of shechita. Ketzat shachtan lishman v'zark daman lishman kidei shalechem. So we're going to go through the different permutations. If you shecht the animal properly, and you did the zrika properly, so the bread is sanctified, and the bread is consumable to the kohanim. Shachtan shelo lishman v'zark daman shelo lishman lo kidei shalechem. If you didn't shecht it properly, and you didn't do the zrika properly, means you did it for the wrong purposes, so the bread never gets sanctified at all. Shachtan lishman v'zark daman shelo lishman lechem kadosh ve'eno kadosh divrei Rabbi. But let's say you shechted it with the right intent for Shavuos, but when you did the zrika, you didn't do the zrika properly, so the bread is sanctified, but it's not sanctified. It's sanctified to the extent where it has kedushas haguf, but it's not sanctified because you didn't achieve the kapara, or the sprinkling of the blood, and therefore the bread cannot be eaten. Rabbi Lazar, Reb Shimon Omer, la'olam eino kadosh alechem ad sheyishchot lishman v'yizrok daman lishman. And the Gemara disagrees, and the Gemara wants to argue that perhaps you could say that this case of what we're talking about, which is the bread from the korban toda, where it was shechted but the blood was spilled out before you had a chance to do zrika, could even go according to Rebbe Lazar Reb Shimon, because Rebbe Lazar Reb Shimon is the one who says that, and we'll see that in just a second. Rebbe Lazar Reb Shimon argues with Rabbi, and he says that the bread of the kibsei atzeres of Shavuos is not fully sanctified until you do both acts. You have to do both the shechita and the zrika. So at first glance, it would seem that our solution of how this bread has kedushas haguf but can't be used would not go according to Rebbe Lazar Reb Shimon. It will only go only according to Rabbi, who says that you can bisect and say that something can have kedushas haguf without being edible because you didn't have the zrika. But according to Rabbi Lazar Reb Shimon, something can't have kedushas haguf until you actually do the zrika, so it can't go according to him. So the Gemara says, no, afilu tema Rabbi Lazar Reb Shimon hacha b'mayaskin and kigonu shniskabel hadam bekos v'nishbach. That no, Rabbi Lazar Reb Shimon could conceivably agree that in this situation the bread could have kedushas haguf, but it's not edible. Why? Because we're talking about a case in our Mishnah where the blood was collected after the korban toda was slaughtered. The blood was collected in a utensil, and at that point it got spilled out. And the Rabbi Lazar Reb Shimon sarver like Kiavua, and in that respect he would hold like his father Reb Shimon, who had said, "The Amar Kol Ha'omed Lizrok Kizaruk Dami," because Reb Shimon had said that as long as you've collected the blood in a receptacle and you're just about to sprinkle it, it's as if it's sprinkled already, as vis-a-vis the halacha of imbuing all of the other components of the korban with kedushas haguf. And therefore, the Gemara wants to suggest that both according to Rebbe and Rebbe Lazar Reb Shimon, the solution of why this bread is called puzzle bread, even though it could still conceivably be from a kosher korban toda on Erev Pesach, is not because it's puzzle belina. That's one solution. But it could also be because, even if it's not puzzle belina, that it's not past its expiration date, it's still puzzle because the animal was slaughtered, but the blood was never sprinkled. Okay, that's where we're holding. Now, Tana Mishum Rebbe Elazar Amru, Kisheros Hayu, Kolzman Shemunachos Kisheros Hayu, Kolzman, that there's another brisa which argues with our Mishnah. This brisa says that the bread was not puzzle, that the bread was totally kosher. It was from a kosher korban toda, and they would deliberately take 2 loaves of bread that were chametz, place them upon the itztabar from a kosher korban toda, and kolzman shemunachos kol ha'ochlin, as long as both loaves were on the bench apparatus, people would know that they could eat. And nitla echas mehen tolenu la'ochlin v'lo sarf. And if one loaf was taken away and there was only one loaf left, people would know, like Rabbi Yehuda had said during the 5th hour, that they can no longer eat, but it's still mutter b'hana'ah. And nitlu shteihen ischiluk kulan sarfinen. But once the last challah was taken away, the last loaf was taken away, then people would know that it was time to burn the chametz. Tanya Abishol Omer, and finally we have another brisa from Abishol who says, Shtei paros hayu charshos bahara mishcha. He says there was even a more conspicuous kind of symbol that existed on the Temple Mount. There were 2 cows that they would have displayed as plowing on Har HaZeisim, on the Mount of Olives, which was visible to the throngs of people on Erev Pesach. And kolzman sheshteim charshos kolam ochlin. And as long as both cows would be visibly plowing, people knew that it was still mutter to eat chametz. Nitla echas mehen tolen lo ochlin v'lo sarfin. If one cow was taken away, there was only one cow left, then people would know that it was the 5th hour where they could no longer eat, but they could still benefit from. Nitlu shteyim eschila kolam sarfim. And when both cows were now removed, the remaining cow was removed, then people would know it was time to burn. Now, why you needed this other symbol instead of the loaves of bread? My Balabatisha explanation would simply be is that this was a much more conspicuous way of getting the word out, because cows are much bigger than loaves of bread. But I don't know whether that's the explanation, or maybe there's something, I'm assuming there's something deeper here as well. You have a wonderful day.